Good evening and welcome to Movie Matters Talk. This will be the concluding talk for this winter series on Newshounds, Journalism at Stake. So welcome. I'm going to be speaking about a film I hope you have managed to view, The Post, director Steven Spielberg, 2017. 1 hour and 56 minutes. Now, I want to lay down this bit of background on what Spielberg did in order to make The Post. He interrupted another production in progress because of the urgency that he saw in the fallout from the Trump presidency. In an interview with a British newspaper, The Guardian, in 2018, after the film was released, Jonathan Friedland said this: Spielberg wanted to make it right now, that is in 2017, assembling screenwriters, crew, and A-list stars, including Meryl Streep and Tom Hanks, making their first film together in a fraction of the usual time. The level of urgency to make The Post was because of the climate of the Trump administration, bombarding the press and labeling the truth as fake if it suited them. The quote goes on from Spielberg himself, saying, "I deeply resented the hashtag alternative facts because I'm a believer in the objective truth." Let's also keep in mind that Spielberg has been called, rightly so, one, if not the most commercially successful filmmaker. He knows what he's doing, directed over 30 films in various genres, executive producer of many other films, working with often with emerging filmmakers at the time. 2013 Band of Brothers TV series, co-produced with Tom Hanks. Tom Hanks was also researcher, writer on the series Band of Brothers. Hanks and Spielberg were also co-producers of other narratives set in World War II. The film Saving Private Ryan, 1998, starring Hanks, and the TV series The Pacific in 2010. So that gives you a little background as to the urgency and kind of a profile on Spielberg. So The Post's co-writers. Liz Hannah wrote the original script. She used her source quite generously from the memoir of Katharine Graham, the publisher of the Washington Post newspaper. Joss Singer widened Hannah's script to give it more historical context, especially around Washington politics and the era of Richard Nixon. Singer was a staff writer, very well experienced on the West Wing television series, you'll remember that, and also the co-writer of Spotlight 2015, that was focused on the Boston Globe's investigation of child molestation by priests. All right, so there's our background. There'll be more background on some of the other players in the film. So The Post, the film, is based on true events around 1971. There's a crisis in newspaper publication. The drama evolves, I should say, around the themes of high risk and action. Spielberg has called it a political thriller genre. I think that works. And also a character drama. It certainly is a character drama. And, it's concerned with the free press advancing, as the saying goes, truth to power in the Washington-Nixon era. In this first image that you're seeing on screen, you're seeing Catherine, and I'm going to call her Kay, as she was typically called in her time by her peers. Catharine Graham, played by Meryl Streep. As I said a little earlier, Graham was the publisher of the Washington Post. And there she is with Ben Bradlee, Tom Hanks, the newsroom managing editor of the Washington Post. Now let's see how this film is structured. The premise begins with an action prologue. The premise about the Vietnam War that looks like in the beginning of this prologue, a rock and roll experience turned into casualties with body bags. So we see this extended sequence of a prologue. Night Patrol, 1966, a skirmish with U.S. platoon in Viet Cong territory, numerous American casualties. In this prologue, Daniel Ellsberg, who is played by the Welsh actor well known for the great TV series The Americans by Matthew Rhys. It's establishing him as a soldier and an eyewitness, war correspondent. Notice the counterpoint of him typing bang, 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 and the whirling helicopters taking the body bags and the wounded away. The sequence continues on the plane with Robert McNamara. Robert McNamara, I'm going to tell you more about him shortly, and he's talking to Daniel Ellsberg. He asks him, are things in better or worse? Daniel Ellsberg says, worse. Upon landing, Ellsberg overhears McNamara say something quite different to the assembled press. We're making progress. The politically appropriate thing to say, representing the Nixon White House. Cut to a scene. Ellsberg is taking classified secret files, many of them a study on the Vietnam War. He gets in a taxi, has a rendezvous with two cohorts, a man and a woman. They go to a secret site to photocopy the files page by page. The atmospheric lighting shows you how tense the moment was. The scene is overlaid with black and white footage from 1950s onward, justifying the American policies regarding the Vietnam War. We see Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson. Truth to tell, Ellsberg himself, in an interview I saw with him, and I watched many, noted how it took weeks upon weeks for him to photograph all these papers. He took his kids with him to the secret site where a photocopier was available and photographed them. Washington Post editor Ben Bradley commented years later in retrospect, lying and misleading public and press was a common strategy among presidents in the White House, underscoring why Daniel Ellsberg became what we call today a whistleblower. Who was Daniel Ellsberg? Here's an image of him on the screen. At roughly, I think it was taken in 2020. Yes, it was. You can see him in old age, still looking quite vital. Who was he? Ellsberg was a political activist in his day and a military analyst, a very bright mind. He worked at the Pentagon in 1964 under Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. In post-Vietnam era, Ellsberg contributed to the preparation of these top secret classified papers, that study you saw being photocopied. The code name for those papers was Pentagon Papers, concerned with the U.S. government's decisions regarding the Vietnam War over all those presidents from Truman through Johnson. McNamara in the film is played by the actor, very effectively, Bruce Greenwood. McNamara was a personal friend and confidant of Catherine K. Graham, the publisher of the Post, which created certain complications for both of them. Now, who was McNamara exactly? In the Kennedy administration, he was Secretary of Defense from 1962 to 1968. He was, at the time, an advocate of deeper involvement in the Vietnam War. Ultimately, he initiated that study, the Pentagon Papers, opposing the war and the bombing, especially, of North Vietnam. And the image you're seeing on the screen is from 1965, when he was still deeply involved. He's pointing for the press to a map of certain areas of Vietnam, and he's briefing the press in 1965 in this image on the Vietnam War. In 1971, Daniel Ellsberg, released the Pentagon Papers to the New York Times reporter Neil Sheehan. The New York Times at the time published 9 excerpts out of 7,000 pages. This later landed into the Supreme Court concerning a possible conflict of interest. Why? Because perhaps, did they or didn't they, the New York Times and the Washington Post used the same sources. That is, the Pentagon Papers, to expose the U.S. involvement in the never-ending Vietnam War. Remember, the Vietnam War never really ended. Under President Johnson, the U.S. just pulled out, and that more or less stopped the war. All right, so I've taken you through the prologue. I've introduced you to certain players that were players in real life that turn up in the world of the narrative of Spielberg's film, The Post. So after this prologue, we get a fade out to the main narrative, Washington, D.C., 1971. So we get into the film's characterization of Meryl Streep as Catherine K. Graham, a Washington Post publisher. She's introduced having a very restless night. She's struggling with the Post's financial troubles at the moment. What's the immediate issue for her? Taking the Washington Post public, taking the company public, and also retaining the family shares, the Graham family shares in the Washington Post. So there's a breakfast meeting in a very elite, posh-looking dining club. It doesn't look like a restaurant to me. It's a meeting between Kay Graham and Post editor Ben Bradlee. She tells him, "We're cash poor," meaning the Post, not Graham herself, a wealthy socialite. Bradlee warns Kay, "Catherine, keep your finger out of my eye." In other words, out of my editor's vision. Also, keep your distance as a publisher from your friend, Robert McNamara. Kay admits she has to cool it with McNamara. And in that scene, notice how the background is packed with powerful-looking men of a certain age in suits. They're all reading newspapers. This is the Washington scene. This is what you do. This is the era before cell phones. In a subsequent early morning scene, Bradlee arrives at Kay's home, a mansion, a beautiful mansion in Washington. She's in her bathrobe. What's he doing there so early? He confronts her with a rhetorical question. Why McNamara is talking to you? Well, you know why, because you're publisher of the Post. In turn, Kay confronts Bradlee about those years in the Kennedy White House where he dined at least once a week with the Kennedy administration. So this friendly interplay between Kay and Ben Bradlee really points to the sensitive but really fine-tuned working publisher-editor relationship. There are key moments of decision-making where Bradlee calls her Mrs. Graham, and in turn she calls him Mr. Bradlee. Now I want to talk about the traditional definition of the separation of publisher and editor in their respective roles. The publisher operates the newspaper as a company. The editor controls the newsroom, the journalists, and the stories. In theory, there's a respective arm's length relationship in the context of a free press. Lucia Moses in 1916, in a piece that she did for Slate, Current Affairs magazine, she's the editor, she quotes the editor-in-chief and chairman of Slate about the respective publisher and editor roles. Quote, "They're not just different roles, they're in conflict in a lot of different ways. The publisher, who's in charge of the business, has a very different mindset. The editor is working for the readers." Rick Edmonds from the Poynter News Literacy Center in 2013 wrote this. "I came up in newspapers at a time when the typical publisher was a clean-cut 60s guy, mostly men, in a nice suit who also knew his stuff. Some came up through news as reporters, but the job was to coordinate otherwise siloed newspaper departments, manage budgets, let newsrooms operate independently, and maybe run the city's United Way campaign on the side. That breed has vanished." So The Post is a film about a powerful woman publisher in a male world. It's also a film about newspaper culture in the 1970s. Publisher Katharine K. Graham was a socialite, a Washington socialite with friends in high political places, and that put her in certain conflicts. Her growth in the world of the film and also in real life had her become a skilled and confident publisher in a world dominated by men. She was a very powerful woman, ultimately. So here's the background to the Washington Post. It was a family-run newspaper from 1917 to 2001. Now, the Washington Post family legacy was not passed on to Kay at her father's death. Instead, the son-in-law, Kay Graham's spouse, was appointed publisher of the Post in 1946. There's a scene in the film where Kay confides to her adult daughter that being a wife and mother was a satisfying thing at the time. In the male world, we see a nervous Kay early on, walking up the stairway at the New York Stock Exchange, past a phalanx of women staff, as if looking to her as a role model. When she walks into the boardroom of the Stock Exchange, it's a thoroughly male domain around the board table. She's pretty much voiceless. She has files with her. She knows the drill, but she cowers as bankers talk around her and over her head. Again, the issue here is about the Washington Post going public into the stock market and still retaining the dominance of family control. So over 2 decades, Katharine Graham, Kay, from 1963 to 1991, was publisher of the Post through the Watergate scandal and President Nixon's resignation. She hired Ben Bradley in 1965 as managing executive editor. Bradley stayed at the Post as editor, a tremendous editor, for almost 30 years to 1991. Bradley's editorial decision is tested when the New York Times publishes the Pentagon Papers in 1971, and so does the Post. This is where there's a challenge by government over the right to share sources, especially because they were classified documents. Now, Streep and Hanks are veteran actors by the time this film is made in 2017. Their performances are very mature. Hank's characterization of Ben Bradlee is as a seasoned professional, energetic, sharp mind, a driver of the newsroom, a risk taker. He's a little bit like Humphrey Bogart, a raspy smoker's voice, an uncompromising editor on a mission. At home, Ben has a warm suburban domestic life in Washington. His wife is an artist. The daughter sells lemonade on the sidewalk. Inside the house, in a very key scene, she offers lemonade to sell and makes a mint, so to speak, selling lemonade to the reporters who would like it spiked, but she says she doesn't do that. A photo on the mantle in the Bradlee home shows Jackie and John Kennedy and Ben Bradlee and his wife in a very social, friendly moment. So this is a reference to Bradlee's liberal leanings and possible conflicts. In a post-dead after Bradlee died, there was a wonderful interview, and there are many, with people who knew Bradlee. They described Bradlee as completely apolitical, genuine. In other words, he could distinguish between the friendship with the Kennedys at the time and his job as an editor. As an editor in the world of the film, Bradlee entrusts reporter Ben Bagdikian, played by Rob Odenkirk. His job is to locate Daniel Ellsberg about the Pentagon files, the sources. We see Bagdikian in a street scene, natural lighting. He's fumbling with coins at a public payphone. This is the pre-cell phone era. There's a sense of secrecy as he keeps having to doggedly try to find Ellsberg. We see the dangers of investigative journalism. In the motel scene with Ellsberg, we see low atmospheric lighting. There's a stealth sense of danger as the Pentagon files, 47 volumes, are spread all over the motel room. Daniel Ellsberg says to the Post reporter, "It took me months to copy. They lied to Congress, the White House. They lied to the public. 70% to avoid humiliation at the defeat of Vietnam War. Wouldn't you go to prison to stop this war?" And that's a prospect for whistleblowers, then as now. Now I want to now talk about the scene in the Bradlee home where it becomes a secret newsroom. It's a very dramatic sequence of scenes, smoky. Reporter Ben Bagdikian, who has taken up an extra seat on a flight back to Washington with boxes of the secret Pentagon files. He delivers these boxes to Bradlee's home. 7,000 pages. He says, "We have the goods." The New York Times articles, in other words, have barely scratched the surface. The reporters, again, sort through all the pages because they are unnumbered. They are under-pressured with 10 hours to a possible story deadline, or at least approval to publish from Kay Graham. Why were the pages unnumbered? Because Ellsberg, before he photocopied them, cut out all of the page numbers at the bottom of each page in order to confuse anybody should they find them. There's a very important phone call that occurs between Bradlee and Kay Graham while these Washington Post reporters are sorting through these papers. There are several players on the extension at Kay's mansion. She's wearing a glamorous caftan, beautiful, embroidered jewels. She ducks out of a party she's hosting. She goes behind closed doors to take this phone call from Bradley. It's a crisis consultation. A couple of her key advisors, including her lawyer, surround her in this room. Kay surprises her advisors because she's persuaded by Ben Bradley's plea on the kitchen phone at his home. We have everything to lose if we don't publish. The country loses, Nixon wins. The camera moves on Kay's face, her resolve. It's her major, major moment. She tells Bradley, let's go, let's go, let's go, let's publish. Now, what I've learned, of course, listening to several interviews, and you should listen to them too, they're marvelous, with Ben Bradley on YouTube. He explains the difference between the decision to publish, which is only a kind of permission that says, all right, now go and do the real work. Now go and do the real research. That's when it begins. All right, so we get a Supreme Court scene where the Post and the New York Times editors and publishers sit together before the court in solidarity. In the scene near the end of the film, on the Supreme Court steps, and this was an improvised scene apparently during the shooting, Kay walks confidently down the steps through a throng of young anti-war protesters, sure of her footing, sure of her reputation and her competence as the most powerful woman and publisher of her generation. You see this image on the screen now. It's 1971. It's Kay Graham and Ben Bradley, the real deal, on the day of the Supreme Court's win. They have walked out. You can see how jubilant they are. Back at the Post newsroom, a woman reporter stands on a chair and she's listening on a phone to the ruling. The newsroom is hushed. She announces 6-3, we win. Justice Black's opinion was that, and this is really key, a free press serves the governed, not the governed. Serves the governed, not the government. In the film's final scene, Kay and Ben Bradley, in long shot, walk together at the Post in the basement where all the rolling out of the paper actually occurs. They are dwarfed by the huge linotype machinery that drives the press runs. Kay quotes her husband on newspaper. Let me try that again. Kay quotes her husband on newspapers as the first rough draft of history. We don't always get it right, but we keep on it. That's the job. Don't you agree? Ben, yes, I do. There is a great respect between Bradley and Graham, and I really urge you to listen and watch the many interviews with them on YouTube. They're very interesting. So they've walked out. Now we get a medium shot of the White House. We've seen many long shots of the White House. Nixon is on the phone, visible as a silhouette, speaking on the phone as always, as if speaking in a vacuum. No reporter from the Washington Post is ever to be in the White House again. A total order. He has the instincts of a powerful president out of control and soon to be out of the White House after Watergate. So the epilogue is a noir night scene. of a security guard doing his rounds at the Watergate office complex. He reports a burglary in progress at the Watergate. This was the clumsy Republican theft of files at the National Democratic headquarters. Under Graham's watch as publisher and Ben Bradley's editorship, two young investigative reporters, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, earned major reputations for themselves and the Washington Post. Front-page articles exposing the Watergate scandal and the Republican players. Here's Graham's reflection on Watergate from her memoir entitled Personal History, published in 1997. My own role throughout Watergate is both easy and hard to define. Watergate, no doubt, was the most important occurrence in my working life, but my involvement was basically peripheral, rarely direct. For the most part, I was behind the scenes. I was a kind of devil's advocate, asking questions all along the way, questions about whether we were being fair, factual, and accurate. Woodward, Bernstein, Bradley had worked throughout these years, along with three other people at the Post, to keep the story alive. Bradley, in a 1986 interview, noted the Post's geographic power, that is, its location in Washington, unlike any other major newspaper. He talks about how the Post wrote longer stories than other newspapers, and I like this line a lot. We like good writing. Now I want to talk a little bit about the production itself, the set design team. They recreated the actual Washington Post newsroom, identified as the bullpen of action. They populated it with typewriters of the era, pre-computers, remember? The Pentagon files that were created for the film were done exactly as the originals were found in the archives, on special paper, just to demonstrate the authenticity. Streep, actors Carrie Coons and Rob Odenak commented on the pleasure of using the site between takes. They would sit on the site of the newsroom. They would have lunch there. Identifying the site as being part of a time machine, the way it was in 1971. Spielberg refers to the actors as the greatest ensemble cast of my life. Streep on Spielberg says he was in command, no rehearsal, just jump in. On set, Spielberg is heard to say, we start shooting until we like it. So the Post was shot in 35 millimeter. This is the standard for theatrical release. This was not a made-for-TV, shot with a tape recorder for television. Cinematographer, the Polish Janusz Kaminski, was a seasoned veteran of filmmaking. Made 20 films with Spielberg, from Schindler's List to The Post. Later in an interview, Kaminski commented on the smart, liberal actors, very aware of what was going on at the time of the shoot, and Trump's trashing of journalism. John Williams' music score, another veteran, like the costume and set designers, was a full orchestral score, swelling music in the linotype machine montage of the printing process scene. Whispers of music, barely audible, creating tension during the photographing by Ellsberg of the Pentagon Papers. Whispers of music when Key decides to publish, let's go, let's go, let's go. Note, the film is dedicated to Nora Ephron, journalist, writer, filmmaker. In a New York Times piece Ephron had when the film came out, when Graham's autobiography had come out, Ephraim had raved about Graham's writing, about how Graham had become prominent in male-dominated journalism. So in 2014, Ben Bradley died at age 93. In 2001, at age 84, Kay Graham died. Who owns the Washington Post now? Well, in 2013, Jeff Bezos, you know who he is, owner of Amazon. And I'm quoting now from the Columbia Journal Review 2016. In the 3 years since Amazon's Jeff Bezos bought the Post, the Washington Post, for $250 million, the Post has reinvented itself with digital speed. Today, the office has the feel of a tech startup. Well-blessed video screens scrolling web analytics hang above the newsroom. Reporters roam the place carrying laptops. In an interview with Bezos in 2018, Forbes magazine, he says, "It is the magazine in the capital city of the most important country in the world. The Washington Post has an incredibly important role to play in this democracy." Brian Stetler, 2021, CNN business reporter, said this: "In 2017, as President Trump bashed the Post and observers talked about a war between Trump and the media, the newspaper's executive editor pushed back with a memorable turn of phrase: 'We're not at war, we're at work.'" And I want to end with this, because it remains to be seen how hands-off Bezos will be as owner of the Post. So far, it seems so good. But that's because there's a very strong editor in place and a lot of various other strong players. I want to conclude at this note by columnist Vinay Menon from the Toronto Star, February 9th, 2021, just a couple of weeks ago, after Joe Biden was elected President of the United States. He titles the piece, "Joe Biden Reads a Newspaper on Air Force One. Why should you care?" And I'm quoting, "Deboarding Air Force One at Newcastle Air National Guard Base in Delaware, President Biden has on a blue mask to protect against the virus, a trench coat to protect against the polar vortex, and in his left hand, a thick bundle of newsprint to protect against ignorance. Just knowing the leader of the free world once again reads newspapers should be comforting to everyone, regardless of politics." Menon concludes, "Biden's mostly a newspaper guy over television, who subscribes to the print edition of the New York Times, and is also a regular reader of the Delaware News Journal, the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal." In other words, there's a real turn here, and the anti-press and the anti-newspaper stance of the Trump era is over. So this concludes the Movie Matters talk for this series on Newshounds, journalism's stake. I think you should be keeping your eye open for the next series that will be in the fall. We're working on it now, and I'm very excited about what we have in mind. In the meantime, I want to thank two very key people. Christine Girardi, who has been filming the series throughout, and today, in her absence, Suzanne Mose, the curator of the History Museum here. Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you, Christine. Good night. Until next time.